Okay, we're ready to go. Well, welcome. My name is Laura Stefani. I'm a partner here at Venable in the communications group, and it's my pleasure to bring you this two-part program on radio receiver regulation. This is part one, which will focus on what can go right. And next week, we'll look at the possibility of what will go wrong. That will be on June 22nd at 2 p.m. The series was prompted by a recent Federal Communications Commission release of a notice of inquiry seeking to gather information on receiver performance with the aim of promoting more efficient spectrum use and spectrum management by encouraging improved receiver interference immunity. So our plan is to provide some guidance and help in thinking about that proceeding so you can navigate it, whether you're going to file comments or you're just going to follow along. The comments and the NOI are due soon, June 27th. And for those of you not familiar, notice of inquiry doesn't propose any specific rules or policy changes, but is intended to seek information and policy suggestions broadly. So it remains to be seen where it could lead to, but those of us who have been involved in spectrum issues for a long time are very interested to see what happens with this proceeding. So my two guests today, I'm very happy to have joining me are Dean Brenner, who is a longtime wireless industry veteran as the former Senior Vice President of Spectrum Strategy at Qualcomm, and now Chair of the FCC's Technological Advisory Council, and JP Vries, who is a scholar in residence at the Atlas Institute and a distinguished advisor at Silicon's Flatiron, both at the University of Colorado, Boulder. And at the time, he was with Silicon Flatirons as director of the Spectrum Policy Initiative. He wrote several TAC papers and white papers on the issue of receiver management. So thank you both so much for joining us today. Let me just start by saying, the fundamental longtime premise of commercial spectrum management is that the FCC regulates transmitters, but not receivers. So some of the questions I'm thinking about are, is this going to change? How is it going to change? Who would benefit? Who could it harm? What would be the impact on manufacturers of devices? What would be the impact on the wide range of spectrum users and any other parties like non-commercial users? And will it force change to devices in the field? There's a lot of questions to talk about. Let's start with a threshold question. The NOI focuses on what it terms efficient spectrum management, and it describes that as being able to optimize the ability of different types of services to operate in different allocations in a manner that does not cause harmful interference to other operations. So the question is, are there actually many receivers in the field, either commercial or non-commercial, that are inefficiently designed so that any type of FCC action, whether it's encouraging voluntary standards or something more prescriptive, can make spectrum use more efficient?
I could start if you like. And first of all, thank you, Laura, for inviting us today, and thanks to the folks at Venable for putting this on. And Venable is very lucky to have you joining Venable and representing Venable clients. So I think first of all, while it is 100% true, exactly true what you said, that the normal paradigm for FCC regulation is that the FCC regulates transmitters. Actually, buried in the NOI in this long notice of inquiry document, there have been several instances where the FCC has taken regulatory action of some sort, and in each of the cases, the action that they took was perhaps slightly different, but they've taken regulatory action with respect to receivers. Most often, where this issue has arisen is, two seemingly incompatible uses that are in spectrum that are adjacent to in adjacent spectrum, and where if all the FCC did was regulate the transmitters and usually there's a newcomer, and if all the FCC did was to adopt transmission standards for the newcomer, there would be some combination of interference to the legacy system to the right or to the left, or the newcomer really wouldn't be able to achieve its highest and best use. So, for example, in the C band, which is a huge 5G band, the FCC did require the satellite operators who are operating in within the same overall band, but in adjacent channels, they required filtering. In another case, the FCC, actually the 800 megahertz Nextel proceeding, the FCC used kind of a cousin of one of the concepts that JP has developed, and JP gets a huge amount of credit for doing a ton of work over more than 2 decades on this whole topic and kind of keeping the intellectual fervor for it alive. But they adopted a system in the 800 megahertz band where if you wanted to get interference protection and you were an incumbent, protection against the newly reorganized, the newcomer, your receiver had to perform to a certain level. So the short answer to your question, well, is this going to affect billions of receivers? Are there billions of receivers out there that are operating inefficiently? Is, I think, really no one knows. And I think the reason that no one knows is that one of the kind of prototypical cases for why the FCC might consider taking some action is in the case of receivers that are where the people buying the receivers don't actually understand that what they're doing is subject to the regulation of the FCC. So a great example of that is GPS. So, when I buy the GPS in my car, I don't understand that to actually entail my doing something that the FCC regulates. I used to serve on the Federal GPS Advisory Council, and I actually asked the question to the folks who run the GPS system, how many receivers are there? How many, billions of devices use the system? And of course, they don't know. So there are many, there are many other examples that we can delve into and many branches to this tree. I think it might also be helpful. I'll just go on for one more second, and then it's really JP should go off on this. What this isn't about, for the most part, is cell phones all of them have a transceiver, right? I mean, there's no market for a phone that just receives or just sends.
Right.
So in the cell phone context, the same architects of the cellular system in the standards process, when they're designing a new technology, they're designing the standards for downloading as much as uploading, for receiving as much as sending. And even more, the network operator is fully aware, is involved with the sale of the devices. Remember, in the GPS example, the folks running the network don't have anything to do with the sale of devices. So, in an area like cellular, where the device transmission and reception is just inextricably, the technology is inextricably tied together. That's probably not what we're talking about. Where it's firmly divorced, that probably is more of a ripe area here. But let me stop there, and I'm anxious to hear JP's thoughts.
Yeah, that's a great point. And JP, in addition to my question, if you want to also go ahead and address the white papers and reports that you've done and kind of summarize what you've looked at, that would be great too.
Thank you, Laura, and I echo Dean's gratitude to Venable. Both of you have teed up a ton of issues, and there's no way that we'll get through all of them. So let me just touch on a few things. I think that, and Laura, I hope that you'll pull us back to some of the questions you asked at the beginning about impact and who's going to be affected. I think one of the questions that you asked was, are there lots of inefficient receivers out there?
Right.
And the FCC framed things in terms of efficiency. Now, I think that actually it's not a helpful framing because its definition of efficiency is very vague, and generally in policy terms, when regulators or when people in DC say efficient, they mean good for me. That's what efficient means. And so whether a receiver is efficient or not depends on who you are. In the same way, the panel, what are the good things that can happen and what are the bad things that can happen depends on who you are. So I would say that anybody who designs and deploys a receiver is making a whole bunch of design decisions, business decisions that incorporate all sorts of things, their business model or their mission, the radio environment that they operate in, and they design their receivers with that in mind. And if that's, a criterion for efficient, those receivers are efficient. The problem seems to arise when the FCC wants to do something different next door. So I've got a band, I've got receivers in here. The adjacent band has always been quiet, and I'm simplifying, but it's always been quiet. And so the fact that their receivers can't reject signals in this adjacent band isn't a problem because there really aren't any.
Right.
Are those receivers inefficient? Well, no. Now the FCC decides it wants to put some other service, typically cellular service, in this adjacent band, a lot more energy that will cause degradation in these receivers. Are these receivers now inefficient? Well, if that's the environment they're in, yes, they are. The issue that we've seen, Dean mentioned GPS, is, GPS has always assumed, rightly or wrongly, that the environment for hundreds of megahertz on either side of their designated operating band is quiet. And the FCC hasn't really effectively communicated to people like GPS, to people, like radar altimeters and others, that things are going to change and how they are going to change. To Dean's point about the cellular industry, I think there's a very important thing that I want to amplify that he said, which is the cellular industry spends enormous effort to develop standards. There are many standards. There are hundreds of people involved for years. And there are receiver standards and transmitter standards, but it's all in one industry. And they are able to balance the interests of the receivers and transmitters because they're both, as Dean said, on both sides of that divide.
Yeah.
Another problem that arises if you have this one band which is dominated by receivers and the other one is generating a lot of energy, its receivers are fine because they know there's going to be a lot of energy. But these folks are not. The last thing I want to mention again is, as you said it right up front, Laura, the FCC has traditionally regulated transmitters, with exceptions that Dean's mentioned. But you need two to tango. It's always receivers and transmitters, but the other side of the binary has sort of been hidden and suppressed. I think the other thing that the FCC has done, and actually all regulators have done, is that they have regulated equipment, not the environment in which the equipment operates. They say, well, your thing needs to transmit this way or receive this way. That transmission and reception has impact on the environment. And so I'm not going to answer your question about all the papers at this point. Let Dean come back. But the approach we developed called harm claim thresholds really is an alternative to equipment specifications on receivers. It says the receivers just get told what's the environment they need to live in, and they get to figure out how they do it.
Great.
And that was fantastic. I'll just add one other point, and it's kind of, I agree with everything Pierre, JP said. The worst case in all of this typically has been where it's the adjacent band is quiet, and so what's happened is the receivers in a given band are actually listening to this quiet band, and that's part of how they're designed to do. And by doing that, they are they are getting better performance. They're achieving certain objectives, but it's sort of surreptitious because they're actually it's fine if the tree falls in the forest and no one hears it, it's all fine until, as JP says, then if there's a change in this quiet environment, now the receivers are camping out in spectrum they were actually not authorized to do. Whether you want to call that inefficient, more harsh, you could say, contrary to the regulation, whatever. But that's kind of the prototypical case of, okay, now what are we going to do? Because there are a lot of these receivers that are camping out. but we want to use this spectrum they're camping out on for socially desirable uses.
Right, it's certainly one we've seen in recent years. So then if the goal is improved spectrum management for the FCC, right, and finding efficiency as they want it, and we've talked about, receivers in the field listening into bands not assigned to them that may have impeded spectrum reallocation, then to what extent is the proceeding a warning to industry or other users, federal users perhaps, that they can't expect to be protected if they have inefficiently designed receivers, or receivers in adjacent channels that are used to having adjacent channels that are quiet? And is it really aimed to do that as opposed to trying to address what's in the field?
I'll take a first cut at that, and then Dean can give the right answer. I think one of the options that the notice tees up is giving a warning. Because it talks about policy and guidance,
right,
as one of the options, and it asks questions about, what should it do? One of the things it talks about is a set of, I think there were 9 basic principles that the Technological Advisory Council came up with, which are high-level things that essentially warn, among other things, receivers that, they have to mitigate interference that's next door to them in the way that Dean was describing. So I think that's certainly one of the options that the FCC's teed up. I mean, I'm not in DC. I'm not a policy person, really. If I had to guess, the most likely outcome from this receiver is that nothing will happen. The second most likely thing is that there will be some policy guidance, and then, third most likely thing is something around, either equipment regulation or use or environment, so receiver standards or home claim thresholds.
Right. That's thinking too.
Yeah, so let me add, by the way, the FCC Technological Advisory Council is totally advisory to the FCC. I am not speaking and would not speak on behalf of the FCC. So again, short answer, we don't know exactly where this proceeding is going to go. There is a long, and as I said, as we were gathering, a long and sordid history that is recounted in the beginning of the document, that there was an NOI about this same topic in 2003. But one of the options which is interesting in that they put in this document is they could have some sort of policy statement, and then that policy statement could then become relevant as the FCC makes spectrum allocation decisions, in specific bands. I think that's possible. It was interesting also that despite the fact that on a partisan basis the FCC is now 2-2, this NOI is something that attracted bipartisan support. So I don't think it's a bipartisan. I don't think it's a partisan issue at all. But I do think that what the FCC doesn't want to do is there's no more free lunch in spectrum. So when the FCC is looking to allocate new spectrum, there really isn't a lot of new spectrum where it's basically vacant, and by giving it to a new use, there's kind of no one is inconvenienced, no one has to change its behavior. No, all this, all the land that the FCC is trying to rezone has something on it. It's got a building, it's got a farm, it's got something on it. And so this issue of, it's hard for me to imagine, let's put it this way, that the same 4 commissioners who enthusiastically adopted this NOI and are very interested in exploring what to do about receivers will just go into the next spectrum proceeding and pay no attention to receivers. It does seem that there's some there. Exactly what it is, I think we don't know. Well, and I'll just say one other thing. Everyone should run out and hire you, Laura, because the real problem, like the folks who are interacting with the FCC on a daily basis because they're getting FCC licenses, they're getting FCC type equipment approvals and that sort of thing. They're really not the main focus here. The main focus, again, are folks that have these receivers, have no are in industries where even the whole industry doesn't feel like they're regulated by the FCC, are basically unaware, are largely, are operating like unaware of the fact that, yeah, receiving means that their equipment is subject to FCC regulation. So exactly where that's going to go, I think we don't know, but that's what makes it interesting.
Sure. I mean, it seems to me just some of the language in the NOI as well as in the various statements of the commissioners when they put it out, a lot of that certainly starts to give a lot of adequate notice. And the question is it enough notice, or does there need to be a policy statement for the FCC to achieve what it wants to achieve?
Yeah, I'd follow up on that. I mean, firstly, kudos especially to Commissioner Symington and then the chair as well for pushing this through. It really shows leadership. I think in terms of whether the proceeding is a warning to your question, Laura, I certainly see the eyebrow raising in terms of regulation by raised eyebrow. I think if nothing else, the NOI is an expression of pain. It's a way for the FCC to communicate to everybody, folks, this is hurting. If you think about how much staff time went into drafting 51 pages, that is a huge investment. So clearly they care. I think that it's necessary. It's not sufficient. I believe that the problem, the reason why we've had all these problems is that the FCC hasn't adequately communicated its intentions with bans. So for example, let's take GPS. It said, oh, yeah, we're going to have this terrestrial cellular thing.
And they'll be protected by Part 15 devices.
Yeah, but clearly it didn't communicate effectively enough what the consequences of this would be. Now, I would argue, home claim thresholds will help to put a number on it. You have to deal with this. But I think also there is a requirement or a desire, a need for the FCC to actually be more transparent long term, and the Technological Advisory Council can help here, but it's not sufficient to actually declare what is it thinking 5 years out, 10 years out, because we are 10 years into GPS and there's still no solution. So it takes at least 10 years notice.
Yeah, the only thing I'll say on notice is, we protect the vigilant in our administrative system, right? So, just to take in almost every example where a party has claimed lack of notice, well, there was notice in an FCC order, in an FCC rule, in the kinds of documents that us FCC geeks look at. There is not the kind of notice, streaming on the front page of the New York Times, or, to maybe take the other extreme, or I take Pierre's point seriously, the communication wasn't effective in the sense of, burying something in footnotes, in a couple paragraphs in a 300-page FCC document, maybe not effective communication to those folks who, again, don't feel that they're regulated by the FCC. But there have been very few instances where the claim of a lack of notice, like there literally was no notice. Usually in some obscure FCC, rather obscure FCC document, if you're not in the FCC world, there was ample notice. And certainly in the radio altimeter case, there was an issue. It was discussed in an FCC order, and when someone says I didn't have notice, they mean I disagree with the FCC order, which I take is kind of a little bit different than saying, like, literally, I had no idea.
Right. Well, so I guess that begs the question as to whether even a policy statement coming out of this would be sufficient, or would the commission need to go further? They ask about kind of creating a design information clearinghouse where they could provide information on filters and other interference characteristics of receivers and transmitters. And is any of that going to help? And I should add, we have a question that came in from the audience as to whether the commission should think of receiver regulation differently when it comes to the safety related receivers versus other types of receivers. So maybe you can.
Well, I mean, to your first point, I'll have a go at the question in terms of what, the notice throws a lot of spaghetti on the wall. There is a lot of spaghetti on the wall. So, who knows?
Very true.
I think that when it comes to safety-related receivers versus other receivers, obviously there are different issues. If nothing else, then the definition of harmful interference is different. It's endanger the functioning of, in the one case, and severely degrade, obstruct, or repeatedly interrupt in the other case. So when the FCC thinks about, how it balances the equities between receivers and transmitters, and what the impacts will be, surely it will think differently. Whether the means it uses are different is not obvious.
Yeah, and I think the question, in a way, it answers itself in the sense of, the FCC operates in a political environment, and even if the FCC doesn't give all that much credence, or is perceived as not giving that much credence to the safety concerns, what we've seen in recent times is the affected industry running to others, to another regulatory agency, to the White House, to perhaps their patrons in Congress. So I think, the reality is that an industry that can make a bona fide safety concern, emphasis here on bona fide, is always going to have a better chance of overcoming some kind of FCC, initiative.
But it should be not only bona fide for my money, it should pass the giggle test as well.
Yeah.
And so to another question that's in the chat about, attack principle, operators should expect and plan for occasional service degradation interruption. How can this be reconciled with public safety and aviation? Well, if I'm on a plane and the people who designed the safety systems in that plane didn't plan for problems, I would be very worried. Any system design always plans for degradation and interruption. I don't know. I heard yesterday, this may be wrong, that planes actually come with 5 radar altimeters. There's redundancy built into the system, and there's different ways of doing redundancy. So I think that to me still stands as an expectation that anybody building a system should operate under.
And public safety and aviation frequency bands generally have very limited types of users in them too. And I think that there's probably more concern about even what's happening in the adjacent channels. And sometimes there's guard bands to provide more protections.
And money solves a lot of these problems, right? So ultimately that gets into the cost of these things, right? But, the fact is that there's a whole history here where the newcomer, through the auction process or through some other process, has to pay the cost of, leveling of ensuring that it can operate effectively in spectrum. Where that gets trickier, of course, is that hard case that I was talking about, where there might be, where there's some large number of devices of receivers, and where those receivers are, camping out and, might have a political equity, but actually weren't operating in accordance with the FCC's rules. So in that case, do you make there's kind of a whole series of hard questions. And, that was reflected during the C-band proceeding, where there was a long extended negotiation over the numbers, billions of dollars that the new wireless companies were going to have to pay to the satellite folks.
So I see we're already up on our half hour of time, and I should say we intentionally cut this short out of respect for our audience members' time. Great conversation. I'll give each of you a couple minutes if you want to add a wrap-up comment. I think you both have kind of already addressed your expectations on where this might lead, but you could address, how this might serve to benefit innovation in general, or the spectrum management in general, or anything else on your mind.
Go ahead, Dean.
Okay, so I think it is very prudent of the FCC to take a look at this. There was a prior effort, as I said, in 2003, and it kind of just went away, but none of the issues went away. And because of the fact that these situations are going to continue, I don't think there's any doubt they're going to continue to arise. They're going to continue to pose technical, political, economic, issues, and usually, important issues. I think it makes sense for the FCC to try to say whether they can move forward in some fashion, whether it would be, some kind of policy statement, whether it would be something more specific than that, we'll just have to see. But I think that anyone who is, into the FCC world should be thinking about this, should be thinking about, how to participate in it, because it really does get to the issues that just keep arising as the FCC tries to make new spectrum bands available. So thanks very much.
Yeah, I'd add to that, more radio services of more different kinds that are more resilient are going to be good for all of us. And the FCC has, by focusing explicitly and almost exclusively on transmitters, has left half of the puzzle hidden under the tablecloth. And so this proceeding actually brings all the puzzle pieces onto the table, and hopefully we'll get a better outcome this time.
Great. Well, thank you both again for your really knowledgeable comments. And for my audience, thanks for attending. And please join us next week for part 2 on June 22nd at 2 p.m., where we'll look at additional issues on this really interesting topic. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.